um, thank you, about 48,000 emails were sent by our action network to lawmakers in Virginia. So that is awesome. I can't imagine where we would have been without those 48,000. So thank you all. We would love it if you would share in the chat any comments you have about that experience. You know, like how easy was it? Did we make it more streamlined for you this year? Did you hate it? You know, any feedback is great. And thank you, Joy. Very easy. So we just can't thank you enough. You know, when we go into meetings with legislators or our partners, some of whom are on here, I think the depth and breadth of our activism is really helpful. So thank you very much. And with that, I will turn it to Monique.
Wonderful. Well, we are really thrilled today to have our expert panel, which is the main focus of our meeting, to really help us sort through where we are here at halftime. So as I introduce each panelist, Amy's going to put you on spotlight so that you will be in front of our group here, especially as more people may be joining. So Connor Kish, we're thrilled to have you, the executive director of the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. It's been a rough and tumble ride, and I know, and you can even compare this to previous sessions. Blair St. Ledger-Olson, legislative director with the Climate Cabinet. Wonderful to have you with us. And Josephus Allmond, staff attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. So we're really thrilled to have you all with us. And Sharon is going to be our facilitator. We did talk ahead of time about some of the topics, but things are still moving. So our hope is to hear from you all about where we're at and where you think things may be headed. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Climate and Clean Energy Working Group, for 48,000 plus emails. That is so awesome. I still can't believe it. It's just, you guys are the best. Okay, this is a great lineup, and I'm going to get going because we have lots of questions to ask, and we're going to reserve some time at the end for you guys to ask questions. Just put questions in the chat or raise your hand at the end, and we will get through as many questions as we can. Connor, my friend, I'm going to start with you. I want you to set the stage before we get into any bill specifics. Prior to the start of this session, what did you realistically expect we could accomplish as a community with respect to climate and clean energy legislation? And how did that expectation live up to the first half of the General Assembly, leading to crossover eve?
Goodness gracious, Sharon. Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. See some familiar faces and some new names as well. Thank you for the invitation. You all should know that I do whatever Sharon asks. So that's why I'm here. So one of the, well, you know, coming off of the elections in November, I think my perspective is that I expected the General Assembly to take action at the necessary depth and breadth to address the climate crisis. And I thought that we could make significant progress building on the Clean Economy Act. There were parts of it that needed some upgrades. There were parts of it that needed to be expanded. There were parts of it, frankly, that were ready to be expanded because the targets were already being met. So we were in a position to go ahead and expand on some of the work that we did in 2020 and 2021. I expected that would occur. I expected that all of the defense that we had been playing over the last couple of years would become much easier, and we would not have to worry as much about defending our priorities. And so I thought, generally speaking, that we were holding the line was fine, and we were going to make some significant progress on clean energy in Virginia. And so I think that's kind of setting the stage for it. I think that we recognize that with the situation in the governor's office at the moment, that we were not going to see massive clean energy and climate laws get signed into law. So we set out to do what we thought would make progress, as I always say, to make the air cleaner, the water cleaner for Virginians. And I think that was the stage we walked up to.
And were your expectations met?
I was hoping I would get away with it.
No.
I can't stop laughing over here, so I'm ready for Connor's response.
Yeah.
No,
I want the unbridled Connor.
the expectations were not met. I think that for the easy stuff, yeah, we defended a bunch of bad stuff, and the House and Senate killed a bunch of bad bills to repeal a bunch of good stuff. So yes, expectations were met on that front. As far as are we going far enough? Did we go far enough to make substantial progress to pass climate and clean energy laws this session? I think the answer is no. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I think that there were some really smart, really easy to understand, really practical pieces of legislation that, for one reason or another, and no, in my opinion, no reason is a good reason, that they've come up with thus far, that haven't passed and have been sent somewhere else or killed. And so expectations on the defense side, yes, of course. Expectations on the offensive side about what we could accomplish this session, I would say that my expectations have not been met.
Given that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to answer a question. You can add to whatever Connor says, but I'll start with you first, since you've set the stage. With so many bills that were killed or watered down, and we're going to get into that, your expectations were clearly not met. I doubt Blair's or Josephus's were either. What were the biggest factors? We know Dominion's out there, but there's messaging. How did the environmental groups do communicating their issues? Just highlight a few of the biggest factors. And Blair and Josephus, I want you to think about that too.
Yeah. I think we're already, at least my organization is, myself personally, are already starting to, think about takeaways from this session. One of the things that I think I'm going to blame ourselves for is we had too many bills. We had way too many bills. One of the biggest successes in terms of leveraging like the totality of it all toward passing something great was the Clean Economy Act in 2020. All of our organizations were working it nonstop. We were working communications, we were working grassroots, we were working digital, we were working phone banks, we were working all of it text banks, all around that really one big initiative. And because we set off after the election with the realization that the governor's office was controlled by who it's controlled by, that we were not going to get the Clean Economy Act 2.0 signed into law. We needed to do it in a smaller, more piecemeal approach. We needed to tackle issues by singularity. We needed to bring smaller pieces of legislation that we could get across not only the chambers, but through the governor's office. And so that split us up. We started to tackle things in different areas. We started to tackle bills one by one. And that makes a messaging argument really, really hard because you got a lot of things to talk about. And here's something else to even add to that, which is that our issues are really complicated. They're hard to explain. They're hard to understand. Trying to follow it makes no sense. There's so many acronyms. It's really hard to galvanize behind complicated stuff. When we had our successes in 2020, Reggie, VCEA, we were really clear about why we were doing it, and everybody had the same ask. Everybody had the same ask, whether you're a grassroots organization, whether you're policy focused, whether you're attorneys, everyone was working toward the same thing. And this year, because we tried to accomplish a lot in a smaller way, we really divided up our time, and we did not have as cohesive a message. So that's a takeaway that's forming.
Blair, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think Connor is right on the money in terms of, you know, what the results so far of this session have been. I am a glass permanently empty kind of person. It's not even half full. It's just dry. So I went into session sort of with lower expectations, I think, of where these legislators would be, if for no other reason than about 40% of them are brand spanking new. And I personally spent a lot of time in the campaign trail with dozens of them, and they knew diddly squat about energy policy, climate policy. They genuinely want to do well, but there's a very big difference between wanting to do well and coming into the body and feeling comfortable voting on things, especially when their leadership is not rallying them to vote on these things. So a combo really, from my perspective, of too many bills, and I'll just say, like, very well-intentioned bills, and not all of the bills were not our doing, for what it's worth. Like, a lot of them just picked up bills and said, I'm going to introduce this and run with it. But too many bills. As someone who has and is responsible for one of those bills, I will also say too many bills. But also, I think something that did not occur, and for understandable reasons to a certain degree, but that we as a community need to get better at, that did not occur off session, is really like deep legislator engagement with these freshmen. They have a lot to learn, as do, for what it's worth, our more senior members. We do not have Jen McClellan in that legislature anymore. And Rip Sullivan cannot single-handedly be responsible for carrying every single climate and clean energy bill, and I think he has 40 of them. So I think what this session really represents for me personally is that we need to deepen our bench of legislators who understand and prioritize our issues. And that's going to take time. And I hope we spend the next, 2 years moving towards, fingers crossed, knock on wood, a 2026 legislative session where there might be a governor who we can pass things through, and really thoughtfully spend the next 2 years building towards those opportunities with some real intention.
Blair, a different perspective. Obviously, very in tune to the policy issues that Connor and Blair are focused on, but you come from the Southern Environmental Law Center. You're a litigator. So do you have anything you want to add from your perspective to, what happened?
It's a very different environment from the State Corporation Commission, where everything is under oath and you have to bring evidence to support your arguments.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we're up against here.
Yeah.
I will say, I don't have a ton to add that Blair and Connor haven't already hit, but I will just echo, I think a lot more work can be done around, candidate education in the off season. We were, trying to radically increase the size of our shared solar programs this year. And I can't tell you how many times I went in to talk to a lawmaker who didn't know what shared solar was. And that's a tough place to start from. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think there are some folks that are eager to work on these issues and become champions on these issues. It's just going to take some time working with them.
Thank you. And Josephus, I feel your pain as, a former retired litigator myself. You can write a brief, you can provide evidence, and it seems so much more logical than lobbying legislators, frankly. So it's a challenge. Okay, thank you, panel. I'm going to move on to some specifics about bills. We're going to talk about just a couple of them, not all the bills, but some that were particularly important to us. And I'd like to start with the solar interconnection bill, which was carried by Rip, who carried, as Blair said, 40-some bills practically, and Suhas. Connor, can you just spend 30 seconds reminding us why that bill was so important and what happened? How did that bill go down? Because that bill went down. Shouldn't have.
Yes, it did. So the issue around interconnection is it has to do essentially with corporations who are entities that are mainly folks who build solar arrays, for the most part on rooftops. They generate between 250 kilowatts and a megawatt of power. And the interconnection bill arises from the issue that occurs when the project is done, it's ready, and it's time to plug it in to the grid, aka connect it with Dominion in this instance. Dominion, for their part, has the ability to charge whatever they want to that individual customer, that individual rooftop, in order to get that project connected to their grid. And so in 2022, Dominion massively raised the prices of interconnection, and really put a stop to the rooftop solar industry in Virginia, at least beyond the residential component. And so this bill set out to address the interconnection problem by coming up with some sort of system for a fair rate for the utility to accept from the solar customer. This bill, as Sharon mentioned, it went down. And quite frankly, this was one of the most difficult bills that I worked on this session, because the power of the utility was at play. The utility wanted a number. If they weren't going to get the number, they were going to say no all the way to the finish line. And that's what they did. They would not move off of the number that they wanted to charge people for interconnecting these projects. And so they just kept hammering all the way down. The negotiations were extremely tense, very challenging, particularly for me as I'm not an energy lawyer, to be trying to figure out what the words mean. But this bill was intended to bring back the rooftop solar industry in Virginia, and it failed. And I think that that is a really, really big problem. We are continuing to see a lot of interest in more rooftop generation for solar across Virginia. People want less solar on farms and forested land than rooftops, and yet we can't connect to the rooftops. So what are we doing? So that's kind of how I framed the discussion around the bill. Ultimately, if I'm being very honest with this group of people, it was the utilities' influence that killed this bill all the way from start to finish.
And by utilities, could we be more specific, Connor? Just for the record?
In this specific case, it was Dominion.
Okay, yeah, no surprises there. I guess we're going to get into this more later, but I just want you guys to be thinking about why Dominion is able to wield such undue influence. This is not the only bill, but we'll get into that shortly. But thank you, Connor. Oh, one thing I did want to query with you. I had heard that something like 140 plus good-sized projects like universities and businesses were not able to connect in the last year or maybe 2 years because of these incredible hikes in interconnection fees. Is that correct?
Yeah, the number that it's somewhere between 60 and 120 projects.
Okay, all right.
I can't quite figure out the exact number. There's a cutoff at different kilowatts and megawatts, but it's roughly 60 to 100 projects, and they're of at least 250 kilowatts each.
Thank you, Connor. Blair, I'm going to turn to you. I have a similar question. You have a story that's a success and a story that failed. One of the bills that we were very interested in was tweaking the Virginia Clean Economy Act. It was called ARC. It was Affordable, Reliable, Competitive Act. It didn't do a whole lot, really. When you get down to it, it was a very incremental bill, and that took a spectacular death. But there was also the SAVE Act, which was a bipartisan bill with many of the same groups, environmental groups, working on both those bills, and that has made it through crossover. So I guess what I'd love for you to do is just remind us one or two key points on ARC, one or two key points on SAVE, and why one is making it and why the other crashed and burned.
All right. Well, knock on wood, cross your fingers because save is on. I mean, it should make it out of both chambers, but it is on its third read in each chamber tomorrow. So yeah, ARC and save. So let's start with ARC, the Affordable, Reliable, Competitive Act, which for all intents and purposes did two things. It raised the distributive generation cap from 1% to 5%, and then it adjusted the floor versus ceiling of 65% versus 35% of third-party ownership under the VCA. And just
And
to
Blair,
give a little,
just to stop you, just so everybody knows, remind
you're
us.
going to ask me what that is, because that's what
Correct.
I figured. So just a little bit of clarification there. In the VCA, we said that 35% of the clean energy being deployed as a part of the VCA needed to be third party owned and be done, with PPAs, power purchase agreements. We, when passing that, thought that 35% was a floor, and the SEC came back and said, no, as written, it is a ceiling. So we were trying to flip that. ARC did not have confusing concepts. But I will tip my hat to the utilities and primarily Dominion, but I will say both of them, because they were really able to paint ARC as deregulation and say things to the effect of, point to Texas, where there is a lot of third-party ownership, and point to third-party ownership of offshore wind projects in New England that have recently gone down. So ARC had a little bit of a narrative problem from that perspective. Not that the bill itself had a narrative problem, but the people opposing it were very, very good at whipping a narrative against it. And then I think the unfortunate kiss of death for ARC was actually that Labor came out ultimately at the last minute and fully opposed the bill. And so that really harmed our ability to get it through a legislature that truly after this election has made deep commitments to labor-based groups. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in the off season on that bill. And in theory, it was sent to SEWR, the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. So if anyone gets hired to run SEWR and there's staff, and I should stop calling it SEWR, but that's what we think of when we think of this commission. It might take a look at it in the off season, but I think that bill is going to take a particular amount of work during the off season. And I think the labor problem is a real problem because right now Dominion has what are called PLAs, which are basically working agreements for proper wages, proper benefits, I'm blanking on the term, but different types of injury insurance and support that don't exist right now with third-party clean energy groups. And so that is a big problem when you are trying to say we want more third-party ownership of the clean energy transition, which theoretically should make it more affordable and competitive, except if the reason why it's more affordable and competitive is because there aren't labor commitments tied up in those projects, then is the reason why it's affordable in line with our just transition and equitable transition goals. So that's something that the clean energy community really needs to tackle in this off season. Now SAVE, which is savings achieved via energy efficiency, it is still alive. Fingers crossed for tomorrow. We do have a bipartisan strategy, and the bill is pretty simple, and it looks nothing like what we thought it was going to. Because the Friday before session, the SEC opened a proceeding to set the next tranche of energy efficiency targets from 2026 through 2028, and they opened that proceeding about 18 months early. We ran this bill in 2024 because my worst case scenario brain said we need to do it before 2025, and yet somehow my worst case scenario brain was still 9 months off. So here we are. And instead, what the bill does is basically gives the SEC the tools that it needs to, after this next tranche of energy efficiency standards, have data and a process that better aligns with better clean energy outcomes. And I will acknowledge that Dominion is fighting us every step of the way on it, but we managed to get APCO Appalachian Power, the other utility, to support it. And so that's been a really big game changer, combined with having Senator Deeds and Delegate Weber as our patrons. Delegate Weber, who is not by any stretch of the imagination seen as anti-Dominion, he takes Dominion money. Senator Deeds, who is obviously does not take Dominion money, but is not seen as being, very radical from anyone's perspective. And so it's really been, we've been able to paint Save, our energy efficiency bill, really as not complicated, not scary. This is just about achieving better energy efficiency goals, and also tying that in with lowering electricity demand that is currently in the Commonwealth skyrocketing, along with reducing people's electricity bills and protecting our farmland and prime forests. And I would just, as like a tiny nugget of an idea that's in my brain, so I'm going to say it out loud because I'll probably forget it in 9 months, but Connor, you should remember it. We should give Weber the interconnection bill next year, because that would be deeply, deeply funny for me to watch. And also, if you paint it as this helps protect forests and farmlands, that man will make it happen. So, future nugget for 2025.
Well, thank you, Blair. I love that, because that gets into strategies, which we're going to talk about shortly. And we do need new strategies for next year. That's clear. I want to talk briefly about data centers, but I think I'm going to go and talk about small nuclear reactors first. And Josephus, I'm going to ask you about that. Small modular nuclear reactors. Small and modular are all kind of, I don't know whether they're really apt descriptors or not, but they're being championed all over the place, from Youngkin to Dominion to legislators such as Marsden. I mean, people love it. Can you explain in a minute or two just what they are and why they are problematic for us in Virginia as the bills have been drafted and written?
So small modular reactors, I think, have generated a lot of excitement because they've been sold as this sort of silver bullet that if they reach, technological and cost feasibility, that we'll just be able to crank these 300 megawatt reactors off of a factory line and put them in places where we need baseload generation, which isn't a cool idea, it sounds like. But the recent history of SMR development in this country is problematic and shows that we should not be relying on that as some sort of silver bullet that's going to, solve the climate crisis for us. So you've still got all of the traditional risks inherent with nuclear technology, the waste, the national security concerns about having to constantly defend those facilities. And then the cost of nuclear is just higher than other energy sources. Lazard does the levelized cost of energy, and they don't even do a separate category for SMRs because it's too hard to predict what the actual cost would be. The one project that was sort of close to getting approved or actually submitting their licensing application at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just crumbled in November, the NuScale project. And that was after costs had ballooned by over 100%. And so, our issue with the bills that we're seeing right now in Virginia really does not have to do with the technology itself. It's the concept that's introduced by these bills, and the extraordinary amount of risk that it places on ratepayers. So traditionally, with a generating unit, the utility doesn't recover any costs that went into building and putting that unit into service until it generates electricity. Now, they can recover financing costs in that interim period, but generally they're not getting anything until the power is on and flowing. This bill allows them to recover costs associated with project development costs before they would ever have to apply for a certificate of public convenience and necessity at the State Corporation Commission, which is what you need to get to build a generating facility in Virginia. So it's allowing them to petition for recovery of these site development costs. But our concern is that there's nothing on the back end that would allow ratepayers to be made whole if this project doesn't come to fruition, like recent SMR development in our country shows is a very likely possibility. And so I can talk, about the differences between the two bills if you'd like, but
I think that's a good summary, because I think really what you've highlighted is, one, we don't necessarily have proven technology. There are risks with nuclear, not that it should necessarily be ruled out because of risk of waste disposal, and which are monumental, frankly, but the real issue is the cost question, and it is 100% cost shifting to the ratepayer at absolutely no risk to Dominion and its shareholders. And I would be curious why you think that the governor, the legislators think this is a good idea. Where else does this happen?
well, not only is there no risk for the utility, but both of these bills, they're insisting on recovering these costs through what's called a rate adjustment clause, which is just, those little surcharges on your bill that you see 10 of that keep growing every year. They would recover these costs through one of those charges, which generates a rate of return. And so the nightmare situation is that the utilities pour hundreds of millions of dollars developing one of these sites. They're not able to get an SMR into operation. And then the only thing that they're required to do under the bills as amended is sell the site and return the proceeds of that sale to ratepayers.
So just to be clear, so not only do they get their costs recovered, but they're going to get their rate of return on top of their investment. So they're actually making money on a project that may never come to fruition, and we get to pay for it 100%.
That's exactly
Okay.
right.
Yeah. So if
And-
that should make everybody really happy on this call.
Yeah, I can't tell you what the excitement is or the sort of attitude towards these bills. I think there's just a lot of hope that this will pencil out and that this will work out for Virginia, even though it hasn't worked anywhere else. And that's not a gamble that we should be making on the backs of ratepayers.
Yeah. Thank you, Josephus. I appreciate that. Connor, I'm going to now go back to data centers. We know there was a plethora of bills out there. Our group chose only one bill because, we're a small group and we try and limit the number of bills. And that bill made the most sense to us, given that the data centers get up to $1 billion over time thus far in tax credits, free giveaways to the data centers, and yet they are gobbling so much energy that they're already procuring 22% of what Dominion generates in Virginia. It seemed to make sense to link those credits to some purchases or procurement of renewable energy and some minimal standards of energy efficiency. Smart bill makes sense. Again, becomes a ratepayer issue, but also it becomes can we even meet our climate and clean energy goals issue? What happened to that bill? And maybe you have to talk about in the context of data centers in general, but it was a big bill for us.
Yeah, it was a big bill for the Sierra Club as well. So basically, you have to back up a little bit to understand what happened with this bill, which is right before session. And this is a credit to everyone here and beyond here that have been working on the data center issue. Because right before the General Assembly session started, the legislators realized they had a problem. They had a political problem with the amount of attention and heat that data centers were bringing upon them. We saw it in Prince William County with the defeat of the incumbent chair of the Board of Supervisors in a primary over, quite frankly, this issue. And so the legislators saw the data center bills coming. knew they had a political problem and had to come up with a solution that would make the most sense to them politically, but also would have some sort of reputable work behind it. So what they did is in, I think, December, they decided to send or approve a study by JLARC, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, which is a fantastic audit organization that is a government body. They do really, really great work. They are reputable. They produce excellent reports. You can go on their website. They have reports going back 20 years. They're very good. They have a big team of really smart people. And General Assembly directed JLARC to study the issue of data centers in Virginia and come back with a report, I think, by October or November of 2024. When we arrived at the General Assembly session and the data center bill started to get hearings in subcommittees and committees, we started to notice what we kind of expected would happen. We can't pass this bill right now because we have to wait for JLARC to study it and tell us what's wrong. And the next bill would come up. We can't pass this bill right now because the JLARC study is happening. So this quickly became a route to defeat essentially the data center adjacent bills even, including this really great bill from Delegate Sullivan and Senator Subramaniam. My hope is that the JLARC study gives some recommendations to the General Assembly that will be hard to ignore. I think that's the best way to put it.
Sharon, do you mind if I add something really quick to that?
I want you to.
I would just say that, so JLARC completed a study on the efficacy of the data center tax credit in July of this year. I think it was July, June or July of 2023. And so coming out of that study, JLARC, so just to tweak something that Connor said, JLARC actually opted to do this study of their own volition through their process. JLARC is made up of General Assembly members, so one could argue that the General Assembly told them, but it was not a piece of legislation instructing JLARC to do this study. JLARC goes through a process where, through their own topics subcommittee, they make decisions about what pieces, what topics, what items they are going to study in the coming year. And given that their study on the JLARC tax credit found that 98.5% or something bonkers to that level of the data center industry in the Commonwealth is directly tied to that tax credit, it became very clear to them that they needed to put an assessment plus constraints around that tax credit. That tax credit was most recently, the sunset was lifted in 2019. And I think JLARC's argument is that a tax credit should help galvanize an industry, but it should not be the sole maintainer of said industry. So I think there is genuine desire to make serious adjustments to that tax credit through the JLARC recommendation process that would then theoretically be passed in 2025, although I will flag that we do not have necessarily a governor who would be on board with that. But that's my 2 cents to add.
Actually, that's very helpful and hopeful, which is something I think we all could use a little bit of hope on the eve of crossover. I want to switch a little bit to strategy now. I mean, we've heard about some of our key priority bills, what happened. We've heard one success story, SAVE, seems to be making it through. But we really need to be thinking about strategies for how to bring legislators on board next year. You know, Blair, you already mentioned deep education, particularly for some of the young members. I don't know what you do about the old members. I mean, you've been trying to educate Dave Marston for how many years? And Connor, I don't know, So the education is obviously part of it. Labor unions, obviously we did not do enough outreach to labor unions, but I'd be curious, and Blair, I'll start with you and then go to Josephus and Connor. What do you think we really need to be focused on? And when I say we, not just our group, but really the environmental community in general, you folks who are, doing this for a living.
Yeah, I think it's really, I'll say twofold. It's really about establishing trust. And something that is my perspective when I work a bill or lobby a legislator is I do not expect them to vote with me 100% of the time. And that is a very clear expectation that I set up front. I am not always going to be on the winning side of an argument, but I do always expect them to hear me out and be transparent with where they stand. And so that's just the relationship that I go into these offices trying to build. And then I just want to circle back to the importance of labor. One of the things that gives me deep pause and concern about the data center conversations is that labor is so fundamentally for these data centers, in particular, the pipe fitters who are losing jobs due to our clean energy transition off of gas pipelines. And data centers, because of the water infrastructure within them, represents a phenomenal just transition job opportunity. And so I worry that our fractures with climate and labor, which I work in a lot of states, and so this is, for what it's worth, not just a Virginia problem, but it is a problem that I don't think Virginia is handling as best as it could. Is trying to come to the table with labor and not, we talk a lot about how our bills mean jobs, but they're not necessarily labor jobs. They're not necessarily prevailing wage jobs. They're not necessarily insured jobs. And that's a really significant problem for our community. And so that is relationship work that needs to be happening really intently or intentionally outside of session to bring in things like prevailing wage or Office of a Just Transition concepts, for instance, into the types of bills. Honestly, the reason why SAVE is alive is because labor supports it. And so, because anything that's really good for energy efficiency develops more things like HVAC jobs and electrician jobs. And so they're by no means working the bill for me, but they're not actively opposed and they support the concept. And so I think that is truly like the one difference between ARC and SAVE is the labor component.
Thank you. That is helpful. Josephus, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think labor is something that we're going to have to learn how to navigate. I just before this call heard that labor is now lobbying in support of the SMR bills as well. So that's great. So there's definitely work to do there, and I think work within our own organizations, because a lot of us who are pushing clean energy transition are also talking about environmental and climate justice. And so are we actually advocating for all of those things in the legislation that we're pushing? Maybe we need to take a look at that. But then I'll just go back to what I said earlier about education. Education on the issues specifically, and then educating the lawmakers on our organizations and knowing what we do. I think a big criticism that we've seen, explicitly and sort of implicitly, if you read the room, is that, when we're coming and raising these ratepayer concerns on the SMR bills, that it's just a tactic because we don't like nuclear. But I think folks need to know that we've, SELC and App Voices have been at the commission for 5, 6, 7 years now, advocating for the least cost implementation of our clean energy transition, so whether that's wind or solar or the grid upgrades that Dominion proposes. Just letting folks know that sort of least cost implementation and looking out for the ratepayer is our bread and butter work and something that we really care about. And so it's, not something that we're just raising in this one context to kill a bill because we don't like the technology. So
Thank you. Connor, I'm going to switch to you, but I'm going to actually ask you a specific question. I want to talk about the gorilla in the room, Dominion. What are we going to do about that? I know that Nancy and Bill are working on this issue with money out, and I don't know if Jessica Mott's on the call tonight, but people are taking this from different angles, but it's a problem.
It is. It quite frankly is. And so, one of the things that I think we've seen this year when we try to work with Dominion is they are sort of back with a vengeance, right? In 2023 session, there was legislation that really kind of went against what they wanted. They did not want to see legislation that passed in 2023 pass. And part of what that did was, amongst a myriad of other things, give the SEC more oversight over the work that they do. And they hate that. Dominion has regrouped. They are, quite frankly, more organized this year. Just being very honest and transparent, their operation is more organized. Their hierarchy is clearer. And there's a lot of, there's just a lot generally riding on the success of Dominion as a company to what happens in the legislature. And so you get things like what Blair just put in the chat. They've got 35 lobbyists on the ground. If you go and Google Dominion's stock over the last 2 years, you will not want to be a shareholder. The stock has plummeted over the last 2 years. So where does that turn? Where does that leave the company to turn? It leaves them to go back to their bread and butter, the legislature in Virginia, regroup, and figure out a way to ensure the success of the company. So in some ways, their employees are doing their job. This year, they're doing their job really well, and they're really organized. Part of the trouble with Dominion is also somewhat related to labor, but not entirely. Dominion is one of the Commonwealth's largest labor employers. The reason that labor supported the offshore wind project is because those are union jobs. Dominion is paying the prevailing wage. They have project labor agreements with a bunch of different unions. So Dominion plays it right. They know that they need labor, and we know we need labor. And so one of the takeaways that I have from this session is you really just can't forget the influence of Dominion. You can't get blindsided by the influence of Dominion. There are a lot of things that I could say about why their influence is the way that it is. The couple that stand out to me is that they are a union company. They employ a lot of experts who have been around a long time. Speaking to Blair's point about relationships, there are legislators that don't think that the people from Dominion are lying to them. They think they're telling the truth, and they really believe that. And the third thing that I'll say is that, Dominion as an entity, if you look at the polling across Virginia, people don't hate Dominion. They don't hate the company. They do not hate the company writ large. And so when you try to deal with legislators on this issue, they're thinking of the people in their district that work for Dominion, and then the people that have a relative that work for Dominion, and the people that are linemen and linewomen working for Dominion, truck drivers working for Dominion. You start to get really integrated into the community really quickly. And so it's a mistake for us to just say, oh, Dominion corrupt, can't deal with it, when we have to deal with the reality of those three things.
I know you, Blair, and Josephus will figure out how to do that between now and next session. So that's that's your mission, should you choose to accept.
I'd like to quit. I don't accept.
I want to switch gears for just a minute, and then we're going to go back to something that's near and dear to my heart. Josephus, can you just give us a quick update on the Reggie litigation? I know folks are, most of us have been sort of following it, but just bring us up to speed.
Yeah, so we originally filed the case up in Northern Virginia. We had 4 clients to begin with. That initial hearing saw the judge basically dismiss 3 of our clients for lack of standing, and said, I'm not going to rule on the standing of the remaining client, but it's based in Floyd County, and so that's where I'm transferring the case to decide that client's standing. And it's the group of energy conservation professionals, the network of energy efficiency and weatherizer implementers who are getting the Reggie funds and doing this work. And so that case went to Floyd County, and the hearing was actually It was supposed to be late January, but was pushed back because the Solicitor General was sick. And so the hearing happened on February 5th, so last Monday. And they heard three things all in one sort of marathon hearing. They heard the challenge to our last remaining client's standing. They heard the state's demurrer, which in Virginia is the equivalent to a motion to dismiss. So basically making the argument that we didn't state a claim or had no real reason to be in court. And then the third part of that hearing was looking at our stay application, which is what requested that the Air Board and DEQ's decision to pull us out of Reggie be halted. And so the judge found that our last remaining client had standing to continue. The demurrer was also largely rejected. The court dismissed one of our claims, but the other two claims will proceed, including the key issue in the case, whether the law requires participation in Reggie or not. And so the judge on the stay application didn't issue an order from the bench, but asked the parties to submit supplemental briefs if they had anything else that they wanted to say after the arguments at the hearing. And so that date was set for 10 days from the 5th. So Nate and the team back in Charlottesville are working on that supplemental response. And then, once we submit those, we'll have to wait a little bit longer for the judge's ruling, but we're hoping that it comes quickly given the nature of the case and what we're dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope you're feeling pretty hopeful about it. I know it's a lot is hanging on this regional greenhouse gas initiative litigation, and you guys are in the center of the storm. So thank you.
Yeah,
Sharon,
wow.
we have a couple questions, and one related to Reggie is how do people track the Reggie case? Oh, and I see Blair answered that with a link to Wetlands Watch.
Well, so they do have a website that's sort of keeping tabs on everything, but for what it's worth, like a lot of this is an active litigation. And so to a certain extent, that's not going to be transparent simply until after things have been decided. But I think the Wetlands Watch, the Gabby from Wetlands Watch keeps up to date to the best of her ability, is probably one of the best resources for public use.
And if you sign up for our alerts, like Blair said, it's active litigation, so you won't get sort of status updates. But when a big decision is made, you'll hear from us.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll try and save a few minutes at the very end. We're running a little bit late. I have one more question, then we'll save a few minutes if you guys can stay 5 minutes extra to answer any questions. So I'm going to go to my last question, which doesn't cover quite everything, but Sierra Club, Virginia League of Conservation Voters, I think Climate Cabinet, you all create sort of legislator scorecards. We don't really want to talk about them in public hearings before committees. I'm fully aware of that, but they are a way to identify who our climate champions are and reward them. And it's also a way to shine a light on those voting records, which are less than stellar, and people that are actively working against climate and clean energy legislation. I guess, how do we rethink how we actually score legislators? This year I found myself very frustrated. Many bills that they were voted in unison. We're going to defer till, we're going to put this off till 2025. Well, that's just another way of killing the bill. Virginia, there's 50 ways to say we're killing the bill, and that's just one of them. But nobody is really held accountable because everybody ultimately agrees, well, we'll just do that. We don't have the votes. We're just going to do that. I'd be curious if you guys could spend just a minute talking about how we might do a better job, or is there a way to do a better job of really holding our legislators more accountable so they can't say, oh, I got a 4.0 or perfect scorecard from Virginia League of Conservation Voters or Sierra Club, when we know behind the scenes they're kind of working against our bills or they're undercutting our bills. So it's a loaded question. It's a tough question. I'll give you guys just 2 minutes to talk about this. Whoever wants to go first can go first.
I think Blair should go.
Well, my answer is I hate scorecards, and that if I were able to score lawmakers based upon how many hours it took me to secure their vote, that their scores would be fundamentally far different. For the exact reason, Sharon, that you just described, a scorecard does not show the entire picture. It doesn't show what work was done behind the scenes. It doesn't show how difficult it was to get someone's vote. It doesn't show whether or not they voted on the original version of the bill or they voted for a watered down version of the bill that we had to water down to secure their vote. So personally, scorecards annoy me. But I do scorecards in 25 states. So unfortunately, scorecards are here to stay. I think, honestly, putting my behavioral scientist hat on for a second, I would think that we sort of need to revisit how we are utilizing scorecards. And if we're really tapping into human behavior when we're using them, and asking ourselves who the audience for scorecards are. Is the audience for scorecards the legislator themselves to create that sense of pride? Or is it purely just a voter education tool? Because they're designed for those audiences are inherently different, and the tool itself needs to be designed differently for those audiences. And to be totally honest, up to you, Connor, I don't know what the heck we're going to score this year for the exact reason that Sharon said, because everything is a unanimous vote to send it to sewer or send it to Shaylark or send it to 2025, with the exception of the bills that lawmakers killed upon our request. So scorecards are going to be rather difficult this year.
I mean, it's the ultimate cop-out, really. So Connor, now it's your turn. You don't get to squeegee out of this.
I really don't know what we're going to do. I think it's going to be a decision that our organization is going to have to make internally about how we treat different motions that the General Assembly has made and what those outcomes are. I could see a situation where we view a motion to continue as a nay vote for the bill, which I'm sure people would find incredibly controversial, but maybe it needs to be done. Could also see an instance where we score less votes and supplement with a narrative where we name legislators by name for doing a good job or for doing a bad job outside of the typical check or X box. I do think that a lot of the motions that you're seeing to carry over bills and motions that are different from killing it in, as you put it, Sharon, are because legislators are worried that they're going to end up on some scorecard and they don't want to. And so what's our response to that? I don't know. There will be a response to it. I'm just not entirely sure what it's going to be made up of at this point. But over the past couple of years, we've had, startings of conversations about whether we get rid of the checks and X's and just write a paragraph about each legislator and what they did or didn't do. At the time, it felt very draconian and that we shouldn't do that. That was 2 years ago. Hey, maybe it's time, maybe it's time. So putting all things back on the table about how we're going to handle the scorecard. But the fact of the matter is it's very difficult, as Blair mentioned.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, and I want to give 5 minutes for question and answer. And I also want to throw the gauntlet down. We've talked about strategies. We've talked about all kinds of things, ways to do better next year. I'm going to invite you guys back sometime during the year to talk about what we're going to do, how we're going to be, how we have changed it up for next year. So be prepared, ladies and gentlemen.
So
Monique?
quick question. Yeah, one question in the chat, and people raise your hand and we'll find you. But one of them in the chat from Nancy ties back to this need for prevailing wage jobs, and how does that jive with the federal tax credits, and particularly tying that into the Inflation Reduction Act, because we should be trying to get as much as we can for the state of Virginia. So how does that sort of tie into everything we talked about this evening, and does it need to be a requirement in bills? Any reaction to that?
Connor, you want me to take a first crack? So the money in the Inflation Reduction Act, like let's think about solar for instance, for clean energy jobs. They do have some wage and labor requirements, But on the whole, those tax credits are for independent companies. They're not being used by utilities. So under the current framework within Virginia, that becomes a more difficult intersection. It does work on things like EV charging under the bipartisan infrastructure law, for instance, the NEVI funds. It works with things under the greenhouse gas reduction fund projects. But energy deployment, because of our build out structure within the Commonwealth right now, is more centrally tied to utility build out. The utilities don't get to tap into those federal dollars anywhere near to the same degree unless they are contracting out as third party projects. And as we know, they are not currently incentivized to do that under Virginia law. So it's a problem.
Great. Anyone want to add anything, or we'll go to Randy? Randy, did you have a quick question?
I do. First, thanks to Sharon and the panelists for a terrific session. Quick question. I'm not familiar with how a JLARC study is done, but given that it seems to be pivotal in terms of what the prospects are next year for data center bills, are there ways that we can influence it? Are there ways that we can affect its scope? How does it work? And what do you suggest in terms of strategic engagement there? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So you can always send a request to your legislator that you would like information to be passed to JLARC or to be included in the JLARC study, and they can get it to them. JLARC itself is also very proactive. I know that just like on our team, like 2 members of our Sierra Club team have already been interviewed by JLARC as part of the study. So they are also like reaching out to people proactively. And then through those conversations, you know, our team is giving them other people that they need to be talking to. A couple of the legislators that actually sit on JLARC have also offered to be helpful. So if you go on the JLARC website and see who is actually a member of JLARC, I don't even know who's on there anymore. I know it's Betsy Carr, Luke Torian, have also said, you know, if you want information, if you want JLARC to have specific information, or you think they should review an article or something of that nature, you can submit it through a legislative office.
And I just put the JLARC the data center resolution. As you'll see, it's pretty dense and robust. And then the second link is the JLARC membership.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I've seen the resolution. I'll check out the membership. Thanks to both of you.
Yeah, and I'll just flag, this is not updated with the new assembly. So there's probably a bunch of open seats on JLARC that people are going to be scrambling over.
Yeah, JLARC hasn't met since December. So their first meeting, I would assume, in April, will likely be taking up new legislative committee members for JLARC.
Great. I don't see any other specific questions. There's, you know, several comments in the chat. So last call for questions. Amy.
Thank you. What should be our priorities in the next 30 days?
Go, Josephus. You've got your hand up.
Well, I was just gonna give a shout out to a couple of the bills, that smaller clean energy bills that are still alive. But we've had a pretty incredible coalition that's been meeting over the past several months. That includes these organizations, you know, PEC, the Nature Conservancy, Energy Foundation. So solar leasing, a bill to basically authorize solar leasing in the Commonwealth because there's some ambiguity in the code right now. That's SB 271 and HB 1062. Those both passed out of their respective chambers. There's a bill with Senator Hashmi, inclusive utility investing, SB 276, that now will create a stakeholder process to explore a version of on-bill financing for solar energy efficiency storage. And then a parking lot solar bill that is also with Senator Hashmi, SB 234, creates a pilot program in Richmond and Chesterfield County to look at how Department of Energy can create an incentive to incentivize more of those projects. So a little bit of good news.
And to that end, which is such a great question, Amy, should we also be continuing to focus on SAVE and the
Yes, please.
okay.
And opposing the small nuclear
That too.
reactors?
Yes, all of the grassroots support in the world to continue putting pressure on your legislators to let them know that you should not be the utilities insurance policy.
So we'll do a full-blown call to action on that. We did a fast people call your legislator call to action, but we'll do a real CTA on that one through our action network. Connor, Barbara Favola's bill.
Oh, solar ready roofs.
Solar ready
Ready
roofs.
is running into trouble. So the House version has died. We are working to figure out why that is happening. But Favola's bill SB 79 is coming over to the House, and hopefully by the time it does, we will have resolved the situation.
Was it the broad, indeterminate local fiscal impact ranging from $0 to $50 million? I'm going to take a guess.
It was that, we think, but
Yeah.
also maybe something else.
I blame Joe Lurch.
Well,
There
tell
is a
us what-
question. Oh,
Tell
go
us
ahead.
what we can do to help frame that issue better, Connor, because we did a pretty robust call to action on that already. We did a ton on SAVE, by the way, Blair.
Yeah, on solar ready roofs, the message should really focus on how this is going to be such a massive cost savings for localities and school districts over the long term. And by long term, I mean just like a couple of years. The fact is that the people are opposing this bill on the grounds that it will increase the initial cost of construction or retrofitting, which is, unfortunate, but they are not considering within the fiscal impact of the bill all of the decades and decades and decades of savings that will exist from having solar on a building that's going to be around for 100 years or more. So the message should be that this bill saves money, and that's why it should pass. And
utility costs are the number 2 costs for schools. The only thing that is higher is salaries. So going solar for schools, and Generation 180 in particular has a lot of resources about why schools should go solar. Really, really is a strong argument for this is about saving schools money.
Great. Thank you. Anything else? Well, I really want to thank the panel. You guys are just awesome. And now you have to come back. So, we'll see you again soon. So thanks, everybody. We'll give you a big hand. And our next meeting is going to be March the 12th. We began with Rip, poor guy, and maybe we need to end with Rip. He had a tough session. So maybe we need to do a little party to honor Rip and to, I don't know, buoy his spirits. So
I'm sure he will appreciate that.
Yeah.
I know.
Anything else?
I do have a sort of a comment, and I didn't want to take up people's time. I know if anybody wants to talk about it, I'm interested too. And because Money Out and Nancy's work and Bill's work on this and this work we've been talking about this. I mean, in the election, how much money we saw coming into it, and from Clean Energy and Dominion, and then the hope to reform it. I'm just wondering, where does that play into all of this? And I don't expect the panel to get into it, but I think it's just on my mind thinking about our election work and what their takeaways on it, of also the money investment and what they're getting and back in return, I'm wondering, on either side. And I'm just curious, the future of that and the money involved and around it in all this election, if we can do these reforms, if even they'd have any kind of impact, I don't know, but with this particular,
Oh.
election, what are your thoughts on all the money that went into it and where they stand on this side of it?
I'll flag that unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, something like 95% of the campaign finance reform bills in this legislative session are no longer with us.
Right. Interest, it's not
So-
is it of interest to us, right? Like that they're both
Right.
sort of having this struggle there.
They're tied too, because so many of the biggest donator obviously is Dominion. So it's
Right.
all mixed up. The reason why Nancy's not doing well is because we're not doing well. I mean, and vice versa.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to point out without being able to
Yeah.
say it eloquently.
It honestly, like, it feels tough for how much money, not that I am LCB, but how much money my organization invested, how many doors I personally knocked. I think there's a lot of dynamics at play this session that are greater than us for what it's worth. There's a lot of establishing dominance within caucuses with new leadership, and we do not have control over that, and we are never going to have control over that. That is really something that, like, these folks need to work out. It's not great that it's, hard, but it's not unique to just us for what it's worth. Like paid family leave, for instance, is clawing its way to life. There's a lot, competitive procurement bills that labor wants have gone down in flames in finance. So it's not just the environmental community. It feels personal to the environmental community because we are the environmental community and we've got like 4 bills left. But this session really hasn't been about policy for really any group. It's been about politics, and the bills that have passed are the bills that folks know are heading to a very clear veto. So I think I'm attempting to be like a millimeter of positivity within my glass, but that the politics that are occurring this session are hopefully just sort of as people get their, first out the gate session in these new positions, and they're going to kind of throw their weight around pretty significantly this session to prove just how much that weight is. And then, God willing, we have a session in 2025 that's more around the merits of policy than just what the politics are. I don't know, Connor, thoughts?
I completely agree with you.
I would love to have this panel on the power left. I just listen and I love that, not about policy, but about politics. It just, it's a good line. I mean, it is really what it is, right?
Hey, Sharon.
Yeah, I see you, Bill.
Yeah. I've been working with Nancy Morgan on the big money out issue. And, there in a chat, in the chat earlier tonight, there was a question about the role of the leadership and the Democratic leadership in the Senate and the House. And that is obviously a big issue. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details, but I mean, Don Scott is, clearly tied to big money interests. And, our bills in the House were sent hither and yon. We had one bill that came up in committee. We couldn't even get one person to make a motion to vote. We had a bill come up, it wasn't even voted on. It didn't go to study, it didn't go to another committee, it wasn't even voted on. And that was it's just an example of what's been going on this session. So we got a lot of work to do.
Well, Bill, it's funny you say that. I skipped a couple of questions, but that was one of them. What is the role of leadership?
Yeah, I mean,
leadership in both the House and the Senate was a disaster for not only you guys, but for us as well. I'd love to hear, if you guys can stay another minute or two, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Josephus, you can take your tie off now, for sure.
For what it's worth, I would be more than happy to have this conversation for the purposes of my own safety in that building. I would love it if we could stop recording before we start getting into issues like this.
Amy, you want to stop the record button? I don't know if she